I was lucky enough to marry Ree Smith, working together on our family ranch west of Pawhuska. I don't think she ever wants to see another feed bill for the rest of her life.
I'm going to take them ranch-style chicken sandwiches, one of my husband's favorite sandwiches. They're grilled chicken breast top.
There are moments in life that divide everything into before and after. One morning you wake up and the world looks exactly the way it always has. And then something happens, something quiet and clinical and devastating, and nothing is ever quite the same again. For Ladd and Ree Drummond, that moment arrived in the form of a medical diagnosis. And from that point forward, the man known to millions as the strong, stoic cowboy behind America's favorite pioneer woman began the process of letting go of everything he thought defined him. This is not a story about defeat. It is not a story about endings. It is a story about what happens when a man who spent his entire life building something is suddenly asked to choose between that something and the person he loves most. And what Ladd Drummond chose tells you everything you need to know about who he really is beneath the dusty boots and the wide-brimmed hat. To understand why what happened matters so much, you first have to understand what the Drummonds built together and what it cost them to build it. Ladd Drummond did not inherit a simple life. He inherited an obligation. The Drummond Land and Cattle Company stretches across hundreds of thousands of acres in Osage County, Oklahoma, making it one of the largest privately held ranches in the entire United States. The sheer scale of that operation is difficult to wrap your mind around. This is not a hobby farm or a weekend retreat. This is a commercial cattle enterprise that has been running continuously for generations, through droughts and downturns, through market crashes and personal tragedies, through everything life in the American heartland can throw at a family. Ladd grew up understanding that the ranch came first. Not because his family was cold or because they didn't value personal happiness, but because the ranch was the family. The land, the cattle, the rhythm of seasons and calving cycles and cattle sales, all of it was woven into the identity of every person who carried the Drummond name. To abandon the ranch, even for a day without good reason, felt like a betrayal of something sacred. That was the world Ladd was born into, and for decades, he lived it without question. Then he met Ree. And Marie Smith, known to the world as Ree Drummond, was not raised on a ranch. She grew up in a suburb of Bartlesville, Oklahoma, attended the University of Southern California, and was on her way to law school in Chicago when she met a quiet, handsome cattle rancher at a local bar during a holiday visit home. What followed was one of those love stories that sounds almost too cinematic to be real. She gave up her plans. He gave her a ring. And together they built something neither of them could have created alone. Ree started a blog in 2006 called The Pioneer Woman, initially writing about her adjustment to ranch life. She wrote about cooking in a house with no grocery store nearby, about raising children alongside cattle drives, about the enormous culture shock of trading city life for wide-open Oklahoma skies. She wrote honestly and humorously, and people responded. Millions of them. Her readership grew into a community, and that community grew into a career that eventually expanded into a Food Network television show, multiple best-selling cookbooks, a retail and restaurant destination in the small town of Pawhuska called the Mercantile, and a lifestyle brand estimated to be worth tens of millions of dollars. Through all of it, Ladd remained in the background. He appeared on the show as the quietly charming husband who made deadpan jokes and ate whatever Ree put in front of him. He was the steady anchor behind a woman who seemed to be in constant, joyful motion. Fans adored him precisely because he seemed so uncomplicated, so grounded, so entirely himself. He wasn't performing anything. He was just Ladd. But what viewers at home never fully saw was the pressure underneath that cheerful surface. Ree was running at a pace that would exhaust most people half her age. Filming seasons of television, testing hundreds of recipes, writing books, managing a retail operation, raising 4 children, and keeping up a daily presence on social media, while also being a rancher's wife, which is itself a full-time job. She made it look effortless, and that was part of her genius. But effortless is almost never actually effortless. Before the diagnosis that changed everything, there was another moment that cracked the foundation just enough to let in the light. In March of 2021, a grass fire broke out on the Drummond Ranch. This is not uncommon in Oklahoma during dry seasons. Ranch families are often their own first responders, loading up fire trucks and heading toward the flames before professional help can arrive. Ladd and his nephew Caleb were both out fighting the fire when the unthinkable happened. Their 2 fire trucks collided in the chaos and smoke. Caleb was in critical condition and was airlifted to the hospital immediately. Ladd, in a move that surprised absolutely nobody who knows him, initially refused an ambulance and drove himself to the emergency room. Doctors discovered he had broken his neck in 2 places. The kind of injury that, depending on the exact location and severity, can paralyze or kill. He was told by medical professionals that he was extraordinarily lucky to be walking, to be talking, to be alive at all. The recovery was long and humbling. Ladd wore a neck brace. He was ordered to rest, genuinely rest, not simply move more slowly while still trying to manage a cattle operation. For a man who had never truly stopped working since childhood, being physically restricted was its own particular form of suffering. He endured it with the same quiet stoicism he brought to everything else. But here is what rarely gets discussed: what that accident did to Ree. She had come within a very narrow margin of losing her husband on their own property on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday in March. The fear that something like that can produce doesn't simply dissolve when the neck brace comes off and the doctors give the all-clear. It settles into you. It changes the way you hear the sound of a truck pulling out of a driveway in the morning. It changes how long a few unreturned text messages feel. That kind of fear becomes a permanent resident in the back of your mind, even when everything appears to be fine. Ree, being Ree, powered through. She took care of Ladd during his recovery while maintaining every professional obligation she had. She wrote about the accident with characteristic warmth and humor, managing to make a terrifying brush with tragedy feel like just another chapter in the great adventure of ranch life. Her audience appreciated her openness, but those closest to her saw something different. A new kind of vigilance, a quieter worry behind the smile. The accident planted a seed. The question of mortality, of impermanence, of what happens to everything they had built if either of them was suddenly gone, had been asked in a very visceral way. Neither of them would speak about it publicly in those terms, but was there, underneath everything, from that point forward. Ree Drummond has always been transparent with her audience. That transparency is not simply a content strategy. It is her fundamental nature. She is a sharer. She processes her life by turning it into stories, and she has spent nearly 2 decades inviting her audience into those stories. They knew her children's personalities. They knew the quirks of ranch life. They knew what she made for dinner on random Wednesday evenings. This was never performance for Ree. It was genuinely who she was. So when the texture of her online presence began to shift, the people who had been paying attention for years felt it immediately. It started subtly. The rambling, confessional blog posts became shorter and more infrequent. The social media content became more polished, more deliberate, less spontaneous. The funny kitchen disasters and the candid, unflattering photos from early mornings on the ranch started disappearing, replaced by carefully composed images that were beautiful but somehow less inhabited. Her comment sections filled with followers asking variations of the same question. "Are you okay? We miss you. Is everything all right?" Ree would respond with warmth, with assurances, with heart emojis. But the woman who had once been constitutionally incapable of oversharing was now clearly, carefully holding something back. Her television production schedule shifted as well. Filming days grew shorter. The shoots that used to run long because Ree had boundless energy and always wanted to try one more thing were now running to a strict clock. Crew members who had worked with her for years noticed that she needed more breaks, more recovery time between setups. She was still professional, still warm, still entirely herself when the camera was rolling. But there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a kind of careful management of resources, as though she was rationing something she couldn't afford to run out of. Cookbook timelines stretched. Promotional obligations were scaled back. The personal appearances and book signings that Ree had always genuinely enjoyed, standing for hours talking to fans, hugging strangers who felt like old friends, became less frequent and more limited in scope. Her team cited scheduling, but the pattern was too consistent and too prolonged to be explained by scheduling alone. Something was wrong, and Ree was protecting everyone around her from knowing exactly what. In early 2024, the full picture emerged. Ree had been experiencing symptoms for some time, the kind that are easy to rationalize away when you are a busy person who is accustomed to functioning at a high level regardless of how you feel. Fatigue, she attributed to a demanding schedule. Headaches, she chalked up to stress. Physical changes, she explained as the natural result of running too fast for too long. She was not ignoring the signs so much as she was interpreting them in the most manageable way available to her. When she finally submitted to a thorough medical evaluation, the results required immediate attention. The diagnosis was serious, the kind that cannot be fixed with a single procedure or a temporary course of treatment. It required long-term management, significant lifestyle adjustment, and a fundamental rethinking of how she was living her life. The specifics have remained largely private, which is both understandable and entirely in keeping with the Drummond family's approach to things that truly matter. They share the joy freely and guard the pain carefully. What became clear in the months that followed was that Ree's body had been absorbing a level of stress and physical demand that was no longer sustainable. The pace she had maintained for years, the pace that had built an empire and connected her to millions of people and created something genuinely remarkable, had extracted a price. And the bill had come due. For Ree, the hardest part was not necessarily the physical reality of the diagnosis, though that was genuinely frightening. The hardest part was what it meant for the life she had constructed. Her entire identity, both personal and professional, was built on capability. On being the person who showed up, who delivered, who made it look manageable even when it wasn't. Being told that she needed to slow down, that she needed to accept limits, that she needed to stop treating her own needs as the last item on a very long list was a profound disruption to her sense of self. She also had to sit with the knowledge that this was not temporary. This was not a situation where she could push through for a few weeks and come out the other side intact. This was a new reality, one she would carry indefinitely, one that required ongoing management and a permanent adjustment to her expectations of herself. The treatment involved specialists, some of them in cities far from Pawhuska, which meant travel and appointments and the particular exhaustion that comes with navigating complex medical systems. It involved medications with side effects she had to learn to manage. It involved dietary and lifestyle changes that were not suggestions but necessities. And it involved, perhaps most challengingly, asking for help from a people she had spent years taking care of. There are people who respond to crisis with words, with declarations, with grand gestures that signal their commitment. And then there are people who simply change their behavior. Lad Drummond is the second kind of person, and he has always been the second kind of person. He did not give a speech. He did not write an emotional social media post. He did not schedule a press conference or sit down for a television interview to explain his feelings about his wife's diagnosis. He simply started doing things differently. Ranch hands who had worked alongside Lad for 20 years began noticing changes in his patterns. He was delegating responsibilities he had never delegated before. Not because he had lost interest or capability, but because he had made a conscious decision to redirect his energy. The man who had insisted on personally overseeing every significant cattle sale began sending his brothers in his place. The morning rounds he had done himself for decades were handed to trusted employees. His truck, usually returned to the house coated in the evidence of a full day's work, started coming back cleaner than anyone could remember. He was home earlier, not because there was less work to do, but because he had decided that something else mattered more than being the last one off the land each evening. This was not a small thing for Lad Drummond. This was, in a very real sense, the most significant thing he had ever done. His entire sense of himself was constructed around his relationship to that ranch and to the work it demanded. His father had lived that way. His grandfather had lived that way. The model he had grown up with was explicit. You give everything to the land, and the land provides everything in return. Personal needs, personal desires, personal relationships are not ignored exactly, but they occupy a secondary position to the demands of the operation. Choosing Ree over the ranch, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the steady accumulation of daily decisions, was Lad saying goodbye to that inherited model. It was him recognizing that the standard he had been measuring himself against for 5 decades was not actually the right standard for this moment in his life. That was a profound internal reckoning for a man who had never had much occasion to question the way things had always been done. His brothers, Tim and Todd, stepped into the space Lad created by stepping back. They took on decision-making authority that had previously been concentrated in Lad alone. Cattle purchases, land management, major operational choices, all of it became collaborative rather than unilateral. For a man who had been the primary decision-maker for as long as anyone could remember, that required a specific kind of trust that does not come naturally to people who have built something with their own hands. He had to believe, genuinely believe, that the operation he loved would be safe in hands other than his own. He learned to believe that because he had to. He went to every medical appointment with Ree. He sat in waiting rooms in cities he didn't know, listening to specialists explain things that were far outside his area of expertise, asking questions when he didn't understand, writing things down so he could look them up later. He learned the names of her medications and what they were for. He learned which side effects were normal and which ones warranted a phone call